Good evening, Erev Tov, and welcome to the second of three sessions for our fall 2020 semester of Tuesday Night Learning at the Shar. We are grateful that you have joined us this evening and grateful to have the opportunity to explore issues that are essential to who we are as a society. And discussing the life of Winston Churchill, as we will this evening, we discuss, of course, the topic of leadership. We reflect on the themes of leadership. It's an international discussion as we host this event from Canada with our eyes on the upcoming elections in the United States, reading about unprecedented peace initiatives in the Middle East. These moments and decisions revolve around the theme of leadership, as they always do. Allow me to share a brief thought from our Torah portion from Noach, the story as we read this week of Noah and the flood. And our sages point out that when the Torah says that Noah is righteous, they say it's right. He's righteous in his generation, bedoro tav, meaning, and according to one opinion, the sages, this is a bit of a dig, meaning he's subjectively righteous, only righteous within the context of his generation. But compare him to any of the other greats in our tradition, he doesn't stand up. Noah is not as righteous as some of the other. Why? Because when it came down to it, when he was commanded to save himself and to build the ark, and when his generation was being destroyed, he saved himself and his family, and he was close with God. He did walk in the path of righteousness. However, he didn't make any overtures. He didn't make any create any initiatives to save others. That's what differentiates true leaders from others who may be great, who may be righteous. The ability to think beyond our own limited experience, the ability to be concerned with a larger welfare. That's what makes some truly great. And I'm excited this evening to learn more about Winston Churchill, to learn about his principles of leadership in the presentation that we'll hear in just a few moments. I remind everyone to please submit your questions into the Q&A button, as there will be opportunities for questions after the talk. And once again, I welcome you to the Shar, virtually at least, and now invite Tuesday Night Learning co-chair Louis Dobrin to introduce this evening's guest speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good evening, everyone. Several years ago, Simon Sebag Montefiore delivered a masterful lecture here at the Shar, speaking on his extraordinary book, Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar. Sebag, as he likes to be called, was delighted with his Shar visit and particularly excited on viewing a photograph in our lower corridor of a 17-year-old Leonard Cohen graduating the Shar Afternoon Hebrew School, standing, as he happened to be, next to Steven Pinker's mother. Sebag mentioned to me that I should invite Andrew Roberts to the Shar, and here he is, this evening from London, a bit past midnight, local time. Andrew Roberts is a British historian and journalist and author of 21 books, including Napoleon the Great, which received wide critical acclaim. Roberts is a visiting professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College London and a visiting research fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. Andrew Roberts has written a masterpiece, Churchill, Walking with Destiny. This was my summer read, a delicious read of 982 pages. The book is learned and wise, but also fun and thrilling. The Financial Times writes, anecdotes sparkle like gems throughout Roberts' book. Stephen Pollard of the Jewish Chronicle puts it well. Roberts manages something I thought impossible. He has given us a new groundbreaking portrait of the man who many consider to be the greatest ever Englishman. This is simply a wonderful book, a living, poetic, stirring yet thought-provoking portrait of a giant. It will be recognized as a classic for generations to come. A few people have remarked to me that this may have been the best book they ever read. Walking with Destiny is a superb book, largely because Churchill is a fascinating and magnificent man. While he undoubtedly had several disagreeable faults, he could be rough, sarcastic, and overbearing. They were countered by a myriad of virtues. The more one gets to know Winston Churchill, the more one likes him. While an aristocrat through and through, he had contempt for humdrum conformity. He was a rule breaker. He had astonishing energy and all his life was extraordinarily hardworking. he had unabashed confidence. He was a bit impetuous with bulldog obstinacy. He remarked to Violet Asquith on their first encounter, "How cruelly short is the allotted span, for all must cram into it." I want to put generalities aside and delve into two topics, and do so by reading extracts taken directly from Robert's book. The first concerns Churchill and the Jews, which itself could be the subject of a lecture. I'm reading from page 95. In December 1905, Churchill published a letter to the Times denouncing the government's Alien Bill, which was intended to restrict the immigration into Britain of Jews escaping from pogroms in Tsarist Russia. "It is expected to appeal to insular prejudice against foreigners," he wrote of the bill, "to racial prejudice against Jews." The British population then stood at 32.5 million. He pointed out that only 1 in 140 were not born in Britain. Jewish immigrants amounted to only about 7,000 a year. This letter was itself intended as an electoral gambit. 1/3 of Churchill's new constituency's voters were Jewish, against 0.7% of the general population, but it also reflected a curious anomaly in this upper-class Victorian. He was a lifelong Philo-Semite. As with so many of his early opinions, Churchill's liking of the Jewish race stemmed from his father, Lord Randolph. So he was not acting solely out of political opportunism when he opposed the Alien Bill. At this point, Roberts provides the following quote from Martin Gilbert, Churchill's official biographer. "While never an uncritical supporter of Zionism, he was one of its most persistent friends and advocates. In a world where Jews were often the objects of scorn, dislike, distrust, and hostility, Churchill held them in high esteem and wanted them to have their rightful place in the world." Then Roberts continues. This helped Churchill in the 1930s, giving him the ability, denied to many anti-Semites across the political spectrum, to spot very clearly and early what kind of man Hitler was. As one of the rare Philo-Semites of his class and background, and sitting for a heavily Jewish constituency over a quarter of a century before Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, his antennae were more highly attuned than those of his parliamentary colleagues. I will conclude with the second topic I wish to raise, namely the deep reservations and, yes, dislike that mainstream conservatives had for Churchill, who was regarded as a traitor to his class and who had abandoned the Conservative Party early in his career. I am reading from page 460. That the majority of conservatives had been proven so spectacularly wrong about Hitler was not going to lessen their antagonism towards Churchill. Indeed, it might have made it worse. Now from page 719. It was wrong to think that the British establishment wholeheartedly supported Churchill's premiership in the darkest days of the Second World War. It tolerated him for the lack of a viable alternative and because he was still popular with the public. It also refused to acknowledge that many of the defeats for which he was being blamed were directly attributable to the failure to heed his warnings and adopt his rearmament proposals in the 1930s. At a deeper level, he could not be forgiven for having been proved right about their flagship policy of those years, appeasement. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a great psychological insight. I believe we are lucky indeed to have Andrew Roberts with us this evening. There will be a Q&A following his talk. Please type in your questions and keep them brief. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to address you this evening, and thank you very much indeed to the Shah for inviting me. I'd like to take you back to Friday, the 10th of May, 1940, the day on which Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. And it was he was actually made Prime Minister by King George VI at Buckingham Palace in the evening, about 6 o'clock in the evening. But on the morning of that day at dawn, Adolf Hitler unleashed blitzkrieg on the West. invading Holland and Belgium, Luxembourg, shortly afterwards also, of course, to invade France. And it was of that day that Winston Churchill said, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." He wrote that in his war memoirs. And what I'd like to talk about is this sense of destiny, because it seems to me impossible to understand Winston Churchill unless you appreciate the driving sense of personal destiny that he had. He was a 16-year-old schoolboy at Harrow when he told his best friend that we shall see great upheavals, terrible struggles in our lives, and that I shall be called upon to save London, save England, and save the empire. He said that when he was 16 years old, and of course, half a century later, precisely that happened. I think one of the reasons that he had this tremendous sense of destiny, there are quite a few ways that he got it, but nonetheless, one of them was the extraordinary number of close brushes with death that he had in his life. He was born 2 months prematurely, which of course back in Victorian England was in itself a close brush with death. He nearly drowned as a young man. When he was only 11 years old, he very nearly died of pneumonia. On that occasion, the doctors gave him brandy, which helped the 11-year-old and certainly gave him a taste for brandy that he get for the rest of his life. He nearly died in a house fire. He was nearly killed on 2 occasions in plane crashes, 3 car crashes, one in New York, where he was crossing the road on 5th Avenue and 76th Street, and a car, being an Englishman, he looked in the wrong direction, and a car came and hit him, very nearly killed him in 1931. And those, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, are only the peacetime close brushes with death. In wartime, of course, he fought on no fewer than 4 continents in 5 campaigns. He took part in the last great cavalry charge of the British Empire at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. And then the following year, he went to South Africa and took part in the Boer War, where he was captured and he escaped from a prisoner of war camp and crossed 300 miles of enemy territory. At one point, he remembered a large vulture following him on the off chance that he wasn't going to make it. And in the First World War, he was the lieutenant colonel in charge of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. And in that position, he was in the front line. And on one occasion, a German whiz-bang, high explosive shell, came and hit the dugout that he'd left 5 minutes beforehand, decapitating everyone inside. And on that occasion, he said that he felt as if he could feel invisible wings beating over him. Winston Churchill was not a Christian. He didn't believe that Jesus was divine, but he did believe that he was a wise rabbi and a great ethical figure. And really, when you look into it theologically, he did believe in an almighty, whose primary duty, really, it seems to me, was to look after Winston Churchill. He was somebody who got an awful lot of things wrong in his life. He got, as I'll come on to in a minute, the really important things, I believe, in the 20th century right. But he made a lot of mistakes. He told his wife when he was in the trenches, in fact, he wrote to her, Clementine, and said, "I should have made nothing if I had not made mistakes." There was a confidence motion in the House of Commons in 1942, which theoretically, if he'd lost it, he would have been forced out as Prime Minister. It was a very low point in the war, 1942. We lost Tobruk, of course, in the June of that year. We'd already lost Singapore in the February. And he was being attacked for the completely useless A-22 tank. And he said on that occasion that when the defects and the teething troubles of the 22 tank were made apparent to all, it would be rechristened appropriately the Churchill. And the reason that line works is the word appropriately, because Churchill realized that he himself had many, many teething troubles and initial defects. He had got so many things wrong. He had got the abdication crisis wrong before the Second World War. He'd got the gold standard wrong. He'd got women's suffrage wrong. He treated Ireland wrong. Primarily, of course, though, his biggest mistake was that of the Dardanelles catastrophe of 1915 and 1916. It was a brilliant idea. The concept was to try to get the Royal Navy and the French Navy through from the Eastern Mediterranean, through the Straits of the Dardanelles, and then to moor it off Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and thereby take the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, out of the First World War. If it had come off, it would have been one of the great strategic coups of really the history of warfare, but it didn't. And on the 18th of March, 1915, the British and French navies lost no fewer than 6 ships trying to get through the Dardanelles. And then and this was largely down to Churchill, and then also down to Churchill was the fact that what they did next was to double down on the defeat, and they landed on the 25th of April, 1915, a vast army on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the western side of the Straits. And over the next 8 months, the terrible fighting there was to cost 147,000 killed and wounded. And this was very much, indeed, entirely blamed on Churchill, although the Committee of Inquiry actually found him innocent of most of it. And he was somebody, luckily, who learned from his mistakes. He learned from every one of his mistakes, all of the ones that I've mentioned. And what he learned from the Dardanelles catastrophe was that he never in the Second World War overruled his chiefs of staff. He would shout at them, and he would have rows with them, and he would bang his fist, and he would burst into tears on some occasions. He'd do anything to try to get his view of the war adopted by the chiefs of staff. But when they all agreed that they were not going to go down his route, and you see it several times in the course of the war, he then did not use his powers, because he was Minister of Defense as well as Prime Minister, to overrule them. And this was a tremendously important aspect of the way in which he was able to learn from his mistakes. He had an upbringing that very much drove him on. I think his sense of destiny can be seen very much in that. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who was a very important Victorian Prime Minister, sorry, not Prime Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, he resigned and therefore never became Prime Minister, and later went mad. Whether or not it was with syphilis or a rare brain disease, we don't know. Nonetheless, he never spotted any brilliance in his son Winston. He thought of him as a failure and a dunce, and he was cruel to him and wrote him letters that, frankly, no father should ever write to any son. A terrible series of letters making clear his contempt for his son. And yet his son, Winston, continued to love his father. And after his father died at the age of 45, when Winston was 20, he sought out his father's friends, and he adopted his father's speaking style, adopted his father's political views, which were the Tory Democrat views of Benjamin Disraeli, and wrote his father's 2-volume biography. And then in 1947, he had a very strange moment, sort of psychodramatic moment, where he believed he met his father, and they had a long conversation of about an hour, in the course of which he never let on to his father that he had been instrumental in helping win the Second World War. So you can very much see in Churchill's relationship with his father a drive to try to impress the shade of his long dead father. His mother, Jenny Jerome, an American born in Brooklyn, was a beautiful society beauty high society sort of hostess who basically had very little to do with Winston as he grew up. In the first 6 months of 1884, when Churchill was 9 years old, she only saw him for 6.5 hours. And yet he didn't, she was having affairs with the Prince of Wales and the Austrian ambassador and so on. And yet he also didn't allow that to in any way affect his love for his mother. He says of her in his wonderful autobiography, My Early Life, which I do recommend that you read immediately after my book, that she shone for me like the evening star, brilliant but at a distance. Churchill is often accused of being an alcoholic and a depressive. He did drink an enormous amount. He had a rhinocerine capacity for alcohol. The amount that would knock out normal people had extraordinarily little effect on him. There's only one occasion in the whole of the Second World War, 2,174 days of the Second World War, in which Churchill was drunk, on the 7th of March, 1944. And he'd been drinking from 6 o'clock in the evening, and it was 3 o'clock the next morning. And what everybody in the Defence Committee of the War Cabinet agreed to do was to have exactly the same meeting the next day, as though the last one hadn't happened. And that was the way they got round it. He wasn't a depressive, but he was the master of alcohol rather than its servant. He was not an alcoholic. He didn't crave it. And he was he a depressive. And this is an interesting aspect. It's always assumed that he was what's called a black dog depressive, but actually he only used the expression black dog once in his whole life. And that was when he was writing to his wife in 1911, at a time when it was a phrase used by Edwardian governesses and matrons to explain their ill-tempered children. Again, he chaired over 900 meetings of the Defence Committee of the War Cabinet in the Second World War, sometimes up until 3 o'clock in the morning. And he never had to not have one because of some kind of manic depression. He got depressed, undoubtedly. He got depressed, I mentioned earlier, in 1942, about the fall of Singapore and the fall of Tobruk. But he was not somebody who was afflicted by the terrible, terrible depression of disease of manic depression, which suddenly would come over people. He wasn't, in that sense, chemically depressed. So how was it? He was always broke all his life, by the way. Because of his spendthrift parents not leaving him very much money, he had to work for a living, and thank God he did. It's tremendously helpful for historians and biographers of his that he did, because he wrote 800 articles. We know what was going through his mind. And he also wrote 37 books, so we know what he was thinking. And his some of his books were tremendously successful. He did, of course, in 1953. Wind up getting the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he got that on his own merits, not just because he was a successful politician. I'm often asked why, mentioning earlier about biographers and historians, I'm often asked why I should bother to have written a book on Churchill, considering that there are 1,009 biographies of him. And the answer is that I was tremendously fortunate that when in the second half of the 2010s, I recognized that there was an enormous number of new sources that were becoming available. And I was very fortunate that Her Majesty the Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father, King George VI's diaries, his wartime diaries. And so I was allowed to go to the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle in the Round Tower there at Windsor Castle and read the King's diaries. And he met Churchill every Tuesday of the Second World War. They had lunch together, and they served themselves from the sideboard because nobody else could be present, because Churchill trusted the king with all of the great secrets of the Second World War, nuclear secrets, the ultra decrypts secrets, which countries were going to be invaded, under what circumstances, which ministers and admirals and generals were going to be hired and fired, and so on. And the king wrote everything down. There was no real reason why they should have got on so well. They really did. The king refers to Churchill as his friend in the diaries, and he was the only one of the king's 4 prime ministers who he called by his Christian name. And he was, and they got on well, even though the king was a staunch supporter of Neville Chamberlain and the policy of appeasement. And Churchill, of course, had been a supporter of the king's elder brother, King Edward VIII, during the abdication crisis. But they got on well and early on, certainly by the time of the Blitz and the Battle of Britain. The Churchill family allowed me to use Pamela Harriman's love letters, which were extremely helpful. She led a very active love life in the Second World War. I was fortunate to be able to use 51 sets of papers that have been deposited at Churchill College archives since the last major biography of him, including Churchill's daughter, Mary Soames's autobiography and her wartime diaries as well. And Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador, his diaries were made available in Moscow during the writing of my book. So there are just endless cornucopia of new sources about Churchill, which means that on pretty much every page of my book, there's something new that hasn't been quoted before about Churchill. So how was it that this extraordinary figure, this highly eccentric man, was able to be not only the first major British politician to spot Adolf Hitler and the Nazis for what they really were in the 1930s, but also the most important and the first of these people, and also had this tremendous foresight that he could also use before the First World War, when he also spotted the danger to the balance of power in Europe posed by the hegemonic Imperial Germany of the Kaiser Wilhelm II. And then after the Second World War also, when he spotted the imperial ambitions in Eastern Europe of Joseph Stalin and Soviet communism. I think that really his foresight stemmed from a number of things, and certainly 3 important ones with regard to Hitler and the Nazis. The first was that he was a Philosemite. He liked Jews. He'd grown up with Jews, gone on holiday with them. His father liked Jews. He was a Zionist from the early days. He represented a very largely Jewish constituency in Manchester Northwest. He was a person who felt comfortable and enjoyed the company of Jews. He, of course, was also part of the government that signed the Balfour Declaration in November 1917. And so you have somebody, therefore, who had an early warning system when it came to Hitler and the Nazis that was not vouchsafed to many of the other parliamentarians of the day of any of the political parties, many of whom were anti-Semitic. The second thing was that he was an historian. And one of the reasons that I'm proud to be an historian was that Winston Churchill was one. He was able to put the danger posed by Hitler and the Nazis into the long continuum of British history, going back to the dangers posed by Spanish Armada under Philip II and during the War of Spanish Accession from King Louis XIV, King Louis XIV of France, and then on to Napoleon, and then the Kaiser against whom he, of course, had fought in the trenches, and then Hitler. So he saw the dangers, the strategic dangers being posed as part of a wider story of threats to Britain. And he also had fought against fanaticism in his life. Up on the northwest frontier in the Sudan and elsewhere, he had the northwest frontier of India and the Sudan. He'd fought, of course, against Islamic fundamentalist fanaticism, and he recognized in it many of the same tropes that he was to find with Hitler and the Nazis. And so you have these things come together and allow him to see the danger early. And what he also needed, of course, as well as this tremendous foresight, was a very powerful oratorical ability, a rhetorical skill that allowed him to explain the danger in language that will live for as long as the English tongue. And in this, he was helped by his theoretical views of public speaking. He actually wrote an article, age 23, entitled The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, which I quote from quite extensively early on in my book, because he was one of those few people who actually went from the theory of public speaking to the practice of it. When he actually wrote The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, he had never given a public speech in his life. But after immense practice, many, many thousands of speeches going up and down the country and around the world, giving public speeches, by the time he became Prime Minister on the 10th of May, 1940, he had honed an oratorical ability and style, which was to stand him in tremendously good stead. It's very interesting in that last paragraph of the We Shall Fight on the Beaches speech of the 4th of June, 1940, he always was once asked what his tricks of the trade were when it came to public speaking. And he said, always use short sentences rather than long ones with lots of sub-clauses and so on. Always use short words, and if possible, use old Anglo-Saxon words, words that the English-speaking peoples have used for 1,000 years. When you look at that last paragraph of that speech, the famous We Shall Fight on the Beaches speech, where he talks about how he's going to fight on the beaches and they're going to fight on the landing grounds and in the hills and the streets and so on, ending with that sublime line, we shall never surrender. Churchill, of those 121 words, all of them, apart from two, all of them came from Old English or Anglo-Saxon. It really was a deliberate use of these short Anglo-Saxon expressions that he knew that worked for the English-speaking peoples. As well as this extraordinary physical courage that I mentioned earlier, and continued during the war, by the way, he actually flew no fewer than 110,000 miles during the Second World War. He was in his 70s in unpressurized cabins outside the United Kingdom, very often within the radius of the Luftwaffe. And he did this on one occasion. Actually, his plane was hit by lightning crossing over the middle of the Atlantic, which could have been extremely dangerous, could have been fatal for him, had the organization that had the magnetic I can't remember the word for it, but anyway, the parts that fly the plane not worked, that would have been the end of him. But as well as this extraordinary physical courage, he had pneumonia 4 times during the war. There was also this fantastic moral courage. In the 1930s, he was shouted down in the House of Commons. He was lambasted in the press. He was ridiculed. He was nearly deselected for his Conservative seat in Essex. He never, on any of these occasions, though, ever changed the message of warning about Adolf Hitler and the Nazis that he had been the first to espouse. And so you have a physical courage that equates to his mental and moral courage. You have this tremendous sense, and he once said something wonderful about courage, which was that it was the most important of all the human attributes because it underpins all the others. And he had this foresight, he had this oratory, and he had this capacity to learn from his mistakes. And when you have all of those things brought together, as you do in Winston Churchill, he was able, therefore, to achieve something that he had set out for himself as a 16-year-old schoolboy half a century earlier. And he did save London and did save Britain. So thank you very much indeed for listening to me. And I would go one stage further and actually say that, in my view, because of that, and because of the way that Britain stayed in the war, thankfully supported obviously by Canada, yours was the only armoured division in the whole of Britain in 1940 after the collapse at Dunkirk. If the Germans had invaded, it would have been Canadians who were going to protect London. And altogether, when one looks at this extraordinary man and the way in which he was able to fulfill this strong sense of destiny that he always had, it wasn't just London and Britain he was saving, it was civilization itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Andrew Roberts. That was really a wonderful presentation. We have a few moments for questions now, a few minutes for questions. And I wanted to start off by picking up on what you discussed in terms of Churchill and language and his use of language. I think it was Edward Murrow who said that he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. And you spoke about his particular speaking style in terms of the short phrases, the word choice. I had read that actually emerged from speech challenges he had as a young man, with a stutter, with a lisp. Can you speak to that as well in terms of the challenges that he overcame? And secondly, is there something in terms of the content? I suppose it's a question about, is there anyone post-Churchill who speaks in a Churchillian way? Is there something that you can see in the modern world of someone who has taken on these styles of his speech to any effect?
Yes, he did have a voice defect, a slight lisp, which he dealt with by speaking. He went to a doctor, Jewish doctor actually, in Harley Street in London, who put small stones into his mouth and made him read words with lots of sibilant S's in the sentence about Spanish ships and so on. And he would read this over and over again until the defect. Well, it never really wholly left him. I mean, even right the way through, you can still hear the sibilant S right the way through to his speeches in the 1940s and 50s. But nonetheless, it certainly didn't hold him back. He himself thought that it made listening to him more interesting, in fact. But I've now completely forgotten the second part of your, oh no, yes. Who else uses Churchillian phraseology? Well, actually very few people have, and rightly so, because you do have to have the level of threat for it to work. And thank God we haven't had a world war since 1945. And so a lot of the more grandiloquent phrases simply wouldn't work under normal circumstances. I think that you can hear echoes of Winston Churchill in some of the speeches that Margaret Thatcher gave at the time of the Falklands crisis back in 1982. She mined her Churchill pretty effectively. And some people try to go for it, but not always succeed. I think you really do have to have the times meeting the individual.
Wonderful, thank you. I was really taken by your description of Churchill's finances. The fact that he was, I don't remember if you said broke or in debt for much of his life. I imagine he made a killing in the later years off of his books, particularly the Second World War series. But simply that he was somebody who wasn't responsible with his finances, whether it was gambling, which is well known, or drinking, or living well beyond his means, a lavish lifestyle. And we're not focusing on the current election cycle in the United States now. That's not the purpose of this lecture. However, I can't help but think of how we evaluate candidates in terms of their own personal finances, reflecting on their ability to be strong leaders. So I want to ask a two-part question. One is just reflecting on his personal finance. How does that fit into the larger picture of Churchill as the leader? And secondly, I suppose it's a question about electability. I'm trying to couch this in contemporary terms, but I think perhaps being broke or that being known about him may have made him unelectable in modern times. Are there any other aspects of Churchill that you would say would make him not a great candidate for office in contemporary times, but was great for his own time?
Well, you're quite right. He teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. There were two occasions in the 1920s when he very nearly had to sell Chartwell, his lovely house in Kent, because he was broke. But his philosophy was very much that if he didn't have any money, he just needed to work harder and bring out more books. And that's very much what he did. He would also write essays for the newspapers on any subject whatsoever. And if the editor didn't want to publish them, he would just put them away in a drawer and wait until there was a different editor, bring them out again and try and publish them later. So what you see in the Second World War is him as Prime Minister, where he could be paid up to £20,000 per article, huge amount of money in those days, just bringing out these old articles that hadn't been used before. And there's an extraordinary moment. I mentioned how eccentric he was. Well, on the 7th of March, 1942, a terrible time in the history of the war, when the Japanese had taken 1/8 of the planet, the Russians were on the retreat through Ukraine, the 8th Army was being pushed back across the North African littoral. The Prime Minister brought out an article entitled, "Are There Men on the Moon?" Concluding that there probably were men on the moon. There were certainly such things as aliens and UFOs. If you can imagine today, pretty much any prime minister, actually Boris Johnson, I could see Boris perhaps writing an article about men on the moon, but not Theresa May or John Major or Gordon Brown. I mean, this would be completely impossible to imagine. So yes, his being broke did lead him down some paths that would make it difficult in modern day politics. Another thing, of course, was that he used to gamble enormously on horses, but also on the stock market. He was always uniformly useless at it. He was the only person who actually managed to lose money even when he was insider dealing. And so you have a whole load of things like that. I'm not sure today whether or not you could really be likely to elect a Prime Minister of Britain anyhow who smoked 160,000 cigars in his life. But equally, I think there are some things about modern politics that he'd have been very good at. He'd have been excellent tweeter, for example. Many of his best lines can be fitted into, his best gags can be fitted into 280 characters or fewer. So I think there's a good argument on both sides.
Thank you. I was really intrigued by your description of the new sources that you uncovered, and in many ways that justified an additional biography of Churchill. Were there any, aside from the particular scope of each of those sources, for example, King George VI and his personal interaction, what happened between them, were there any big ideas about Churchill that emerged in your work as opposed, or in addition to what came before, that you uncovered in those sources, in those new sources?
Oh yes, very much. Well, the thing I think that's quite surprising, it shouldn't really be surprising, but it certainly surprised me, is the extent in the King's diaries that one sees Churchill being willing to criticize the Americans over all sorts of things. He was quite waspish about Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, right the way down to things like where the ships were positioned in Pearl Harbor, for example. And of course, he actually, in a sense, used the king as a sounding board, somebody he knew wasn't after his job, and who would give him completely objective advice, and was 100% on Britain's side. And so he was somebody who one could say things to that you couldn't tell Parliament or the press or the cabinet even. So I think that was one of the things that came through loud and clear in I hope, at least, in my book.
Thank you. Could perhaps some of his thinking, a question came in, perhaps some of his thinking vis-a-vis the Jewish community or Jews in general help Jews in the UK today who perhaps feel isolated or distanced from their political parties?
I think so, yes. His admiration for Jews was something that, as an aristocrat of his age and class and background, was unusual. But I'm afraid today, luckily, we no longer have the leader of the Labour Party, who frankly was anti-Semitic. But we're working hard now, I think, or at least the members of the Labour Party are working hard to put that side of it behind them. Conservatives like myself, Thatcherites like myself, have always had pretty strong philo-Semitic leanings anyhow. So I don't think that we need too much work done on us. But yes, it's an unpleasant and dangerous and difficult time for Britain's Jews at the moment. And I think the fact that the greatest Englishman who ever lived was a great supporter of the Jewish cause is something that I hope some English people can take solace from.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are a few questions about Churchill and fascism, in that he saw the danger of Hitler years in advance, well before many others did. But I guess that's a two-part question. Number one, what was his approach to Mussolini, which was different than Hitler? But can you speak to that as well? And the second part is, what did he do practically? What was Churchill's legacy in terms of action in countering the Nazi extermination of the Jews during the war?
Well, with regard to Mussolini, he started off very badly indeed. And indeed with General Franco as well. I think it's worthwhile to say both of those fascists, he did not denounce them aggressively enough and early enough. And in Mussolini's case, he actually said very positive things about Mussolini when Mussolini was fighting the communists. His number one hatred really from 1917 up until the rise of Hitler was communism. And he saw Mussolini as somebody who was blocking a communist takeover of Italy, just as General Franco was blocking a Soviet-inspired takeover of Spain. And so he supported the non-intervention policy of Britain and France at the time of the Spanish Civil War. He also did see that if the communists had won in Spain in the Spanish Civil War, Hitler would be very unlikely to have stopped at the Spanish border in the Second World War, and that would have been a threat to Gibraltar, which could have lost the Royal Navy the capacity to go in and out of the Mediterranean, at least from the Atlantic side. So, you know, there was an important strategic element to that. But overall, yes, he was very quick on the Hitler and the Nazis, and far too slow, frankly, with regard to the Italian fascists. Although, of course, later on in the war, some of his most brilliant and crushing barbs were directed at bombing of Auschwitz, which was something that, of course, was desperately needed to have done. He was in favor of doing it, and he wrote a minute to Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, saying, "Invoke me, this needs to be done, invoke me if necessary." This was after Jan Karski, the Pole, got the news of Auschwitz out to both the British and the American governments. And then after that, it just didn't happen. The bombing of the railway lines to and from Auschwitz, especially, of course, after the massacre of the Hungarian Jews after March 1944, would have been an extremely good idea. But it got lost, frankly, in the American bureaucracy. They were the ones who did the daylight raids. It couldn't hit railway lines from during nighttime bombing, which is what the RAF did. And I'm afraid John McCloy and others have got a terrible thing to answer for. Frankly, they just sat on it. It was a very difficult operation, of course, getting heavy bombers out from England and Italy, hundreds of miles over Poland. But nevertheless, it could have been done, and it should have been done, and it wasn't done. And I go into this in some detail in my book.
I think it's certainly one thing to talk about his role as leadership, but how about his perception of his own role? Meaning, he doesn't mention, as far as I understand, he doesn't mention the Holocaust or the extermination of the Jews in his World War II memoirs.
Yes, he does. No, he does. He says it's the most unspeakable crime in the history of mankind.
Okay. I want to.
Which he also, of course, said in the House of Commons. You know, there's absolutely there's no doubt about his views on the Holocaust, I assure you.
Speaking about his personal life for a moment, his own, I was really taken by your description of his parents and that complex relationship, that time, his mother, that limited time. Was it 6.5? What was it? Hours?
6.5 hours and 6 months. Yes.
6 months is unthinkable, especially as we've been spending so much time with our kids during this pandemic. 6.5 hours. I want to understand him as a parent, though, having experienced that as a child from his parents. What was Churchill like as a parent to his own children?
Well, he was a very good father to his daughters. He loved them dearly, especially the youngest, Mary, who I knew quite well. The first two, the eldest daughters, Diana and Sarah, neither of them turned out well. I don't think that can be primarily blamed on their father. They were both alcoholics, in fact, but the real problem was Randolph, the son, who just found it very difficult to have a famous person as his father. Even though Winston Churchill, of course, had a famous person as his father. It's a well-known difficult thing to have a famous father, but nonetheless, Winston Churchill himself had managed to. But his relationships with really 3 of his 4 children can't ultimately be said to have been successful, and Diana, very tragically, in fact, took her own life.
I want to close with one question, and perhaps it sounds a bit mundane or banal, but I think it's an important question, in that, you know, we know Churchill from history, we know Churchill from biographies, but perhaps even more so, we know Churchill of the anecdotes, the Churchill stories, and also the quotes, the great quotes. Do you, as a biographer of Churchill, have a go-to anecdote? I wouldn't say favorite, but a go-to anecdote that you think highlights who Churchill was as a person and as a leader? And the same question about a quote, a go-to Churchill quote.
Yes, well, let me tell you a couple of Churchill jokes, anecdote jokes in that case, and then maybe I'll go and grab my book from the shelf over there and give you a quotation, if I may. The 2 jokes that I'm enjoying most at the moment. There's one moment where his private secretary, Jock Colville, came to him and told him that their cook had been made pregnant as the result of a nocturnal assignation with a man in the street in Verona. And Winston Churchill replied, obviously not one of the 2 gentlemen. And the other one was when Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, came up to him at a reception in London before the war and said, and said, in the next war, Italy, in a threatening manner, Italy will be on the same side as the Third Reich. And Churchill replied, well, it seems only fair. We had to have them last time. Let me just read this book, hang on. This is a quotation from the speech he made at Neville Chamberlain's funeral in November 1940. Let me just put you in the picture. It's a freezing cold day. They're at Westminster Abbey. All of the beautiful stained glass has been taken out of the Abbey and taken off to some Welsh mine to protect it from the Blitz. And it's all boarded up. And he's making this speech to somebody who was essentially, one of his worst enemies in politics, the person who kept him out of the British government in the 1930s when he was warning and desperate to try to get increased arms manufacturers and the Spitfires built and so on. And he said this about Neville Chamberlain, but also about history. And it's not a long quotation, but it's utterly poetic in my view. He said this in the eulogy. History, with its flickering lamp, stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, and kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days. What is the worth of all this? The only guide to a man is his conscience. The only shield to his memory is the rectitude and sincerity of his actions. It's very imprudent to walk through life without this shield, because we are so often mocked by the failure of our hopes and the upsetting of our calculations. But with this shield, however the fates may play, we march always in the ranks of honor.
Wow, thank you. Very, very powerful. Thank you very much. I know we all learned a great deal. I certainly did, and certainly enjoyed it in the process. I'll now turn it over to Lewis Dobrin to share our gratitude.
In thinking about how to thank our speaker tonight, I reflected on the fact that there have been 1,009 biographies of Winston Churchill, the latest by Roy Jenkins in 2001. Andrew Roberts explained to us how he did source some marvelous new material. And there's apparently been, so much new to be said about Britain's great wartime leader. Wow. Andrew, like your magnificent book, your talk was, you delivered the talk with verve and vitality. Really, bravo. Thank you so much. We really, really liked your visit at the Shire. And ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned for next week when Janice Stein, in conversation with Stephen Lipper, will discuss the US election. Good night, everyone.